Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. We're honored to welcome Assemblymember Tasha Boerner, who represents California's 77th Assembly District, encompassing coastal communities from Carlsbad and Encinitas, south through La Jolla to Coronado. Assemblymember Boerner has served in the State Assembly since 2018, and she currently chairs both the Assembly Communications and Conveyance Committee and the Assembly Select Committee on Sea Level Rise and the California Economy, a committee to address the urgent threats facing California's coastline. Her environmental leadership is evident in her successful legislation, including AB 823, which unanimously passed to ban plastic microbeads and leave-on personal care and cleaning products, and groundbreaking work to address plastic litter pollution. Before her legislative career, she served on the Encinitas City Council and Planning Commission, where her advocacy began with a simple goal: getting a stop sign installed near her children's school. Assemblymember Boerner holds a master's degree in international studies from Claremont Graduate University and a bachelor's in political science from UC Berkeley. She brings a blend of local government experience, business acumen, and a passionate advocacy for coastal resilience, environmental protection, and community-centered policy to her work in Sacramento. Join us as we discuss her approach to environmental leadership, coastal adaptation, and shaping California's environmental future. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy. Hi, I'm Jessa.
Hi, I'm Corinne.
And today we have Assemblymember Tasha Boerner from District 77 in California. Thank you so much for joining us today, Assemblymember.
Thank you, Jess and Corinne. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So excited for this one. So first things first, how are you connected with AEP?
So I do a lot of environmental work in the legislature. I got elected, and the reason I ran for office was to save the planet for our kids. And so obviously you are the Association of Environmental Professionals. So we have a lot going on, and we met earlier this year. And so when the request came through to be on your podcast, I have my own podcast, Tea Time with Tasha. I love podcasts. And so I was like, of course.
Thank you so much. And we'll link that in the show notes too, so people can find your podcast easily as well. So yeah, we appreciate your time. I know you got a lot going on, but thanks for joining us today. So just to get into it, can you tell us about your path to leadership? So what spurred your interest in community and legislative work, and how has your experience shaped your approach to environmental policy at the state level? A lot in there.
It's a lot in there. So I'll just start somewhere and we can see where we end up. So in 2015, I was a mom who wanted a stop sign near my kid's school. I had lived in Germany for 12 years, and it was taking us 45 minutes to drop off our kids in the morning, 45 minutes to pick them up. And I was far too efficient to waste 920 hours of my life to drop off and pick up. So probably if I had been in another context, I would have been an organizer, a labor organizer. But I wasn't. I was a PTA mom. And so people have been trying to get in the stop sign near Pollack Central and Encinitas for about 20 years, and we got it in 6 months. And so, Catherine Blakespeare, who's now a state senator, was like, you should run for office. I was like, Catherine, a stop sign is a horrible qualification for local government. I had studied political science. I hate two-party systems. I like multi-party systems. And so that's what I studied. But then I got on the Planning Commission in Encinitas. I was elected to the City Council in 2016, and I was the bench for Assembly in 2018, and I won that election. And here I am trying to save the planet for our kids in 2025.
You make it sound so easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy. I'm divorced. I'm gone in Sacramento 4 days a week. My daughter cried every single night for the first year. Every time I was gone, there was a lot of sacrifices in there.
You're like, I'm doing this for you.
And she understands it. She's 14, and she was talking to somebody who was thinking about running for Assembly. And I said, well, why don't you tell my friend what your experience has been? And she said, yes, I cried every night, but I know my mom can help thousands of people every year. And so I'm just one of those people. And so if my 14-year-old can figure that out, then, it's a net wash, help save the planet for her. And, what I do think about our young people now is, and maybe it's because she's my daughter and she hears all these Zoom calls and podcast, so she probably has more inside information than she probably is good for her or needs. But they do have existential angst about the planet in the future, right? And so knowing that her mom is trying to make progress and seeing that steps are being done, and for all the young professionals out there working in the environmental space, we're going to need you. We're going to need you all working towards it. I don't think anybody has the plan or the magic bullet for how we're going to save the planet. It's going to be the sum of every small and big action to get there.
Assemblymember, if it helps at all, when I was growing up, my mom was a city council member for the city of Palo Alto. She was an environmental professional turned politician turned city council member. I'm now an environmental professional, so second generation, and her doing that work was completely invaluable for me. And it's certainly hard. I'm sure I threw my fair share of tantrums as well, but I could not be where I was without my mom doing that role and instilling, those values in me. So I promise you, your daughter will be sitting where I am in, probably more years than I care to say what my age is, and she will appreciate every second that you spent doing it.
I think she does. She was 7 when I got elected to the assembly. She was 5 when I got elected to city council. So she kind of doesn't remember a life where I wasn't elected. My son is 3 years older. So he remembers when I was making lunches and making dinners every night. He remembers all that. But she doesn't, so, but it's, as moms, we all balance. How do we be a mother, take care of our children, and do the work that we find empowering and impactful? And I think that's one of the signs of women leadership is we don't lead like men do, right? I think there's a tendency, and I know I saw it growing up, is to be successful as a woman, you had to look like a man. And I think now you're getting this critical mass of women who are leading from a place of nurture and leading from a place of that collective and that village and taking care of others and kindness. And I hope to see more of it.
Oh, I love this. This is just so inspiring already, and we're just getting started. So you represent California's 77th district, which includes some of the most states, or the state's most iconic coastal communities. And I can say that because Corinne and I are in those coastal communities. So how does representing the coastal district a coastal district, I should say, inform your environmental policies and your legislative agenda?
Well, I think every part of California is seeing the impact of the climate crisis, right? If you're inland, you're seeing extreme heat. If you have wildfires, that's a product of the climate crisis. And for us, we see it kind of in San Diego, most apparently in bluff collapses. We've always had bluff collapses. They're more frequent, they're more deadly. And so that's, for example, when we had the bluff collapse in Grandview a couple of years ago in 2019, it was what spawned an entire body of work, which it's funny because I went in and I was like, didn't know it was going to be my legacy, but it probably will be my legacy, which is we've actually worked with Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and we've created an early warning notification system for bluff collapses that can predict when bluffs are going to collapse. So people have time to run into the ocean and not die, right? And when you think about that, that's very present for us on the coast. We see king tides combined with the atmospheric river creates havoc in our communities. We just saw it. We don't have the infrastructure for storm drains. So you see, I think it was January of last year, you saw the horrific flooding that happened in places people didn't even know were flood zones. Well, you guys, you're environmental professionals, they were flood zones. No one else knew they were flood zones. And so you see this impact. And so I think everybody sees it. And just because I agree, I have some of the most iconic coastline. I used to have, my old district was Encinitas, Carlsbad, Oceanside, Vista, and Camp Pendleton. And so my second year, we saved trestles from road construction in perpetuity, which was like a 15-year fight. I was just like the last baton that crossed the finish line, right? And so I don't take credit because I think it was everybody's work to do that. I thought that was going to be my legacy. And then we have the fact that science, one of the things about the bluff collapse bill, which was AB 66 and 72, was I went to Scripps. I was like, we need a light and a sound that goes off when the bluff's about to collapse because you need 10 seconds to run into the ocean. And they said, that's fine, assembly member, but we don't know the science around bluff failures. We could tell you after the fact why they collapse. We can't predict it. So I was like, well, how do you create the science? You guys, we need to get all of you smart environmental science professors out in the field telling us how we protect people. And I think this is going to be the innovation that saves California, is getting environmentalists and our smart scientists together with environmental professionals saying, these are real life problems. Academia, come to us. And there are liability issues, which was the core of AB 66, but it's also like, how do we get it? And the idea was the AB 66 is we would do a pilot project. So the pilot project is at Beacons Beach and the Del Mar Bluffs. They're about to fall into the ocean, which affects our rail corridor, which is the second busiest rail corridor in the United States. 1 out of 10 new cars come in through the Port of San Diego and go along that rail line. So it's a huge economic impact when the trains stop. And when we look at it, bringing the scientists to the real world problems, that's how we're innovating. And we thought about it, we're like, okay, we'll do these 2 pilot projects, then we'll do the San Diego coast, and then maybe we'll do the California coast, and then maybe do the West Coast. I think the next step when we get the report in March of this next year will probably be a California-wide pilot, because everybody is very interested in this, because we're not the only ones in 8077 affected by bluff collapses. That was a long answer to your 8077 question. I'm not sure I actually answered the question about how it impacts my environmental agenda. I think I do lots of things. I do recycling. I do anything basically anything that reduces greenhouse gases. Like I try to do something on, especially blue carbon. Like I love natural carbon sequestration. For those of you, like your science people will probably know what like natural carbon sequestration is. For people who maybe aren't there yet, it's like our salt marshes and our seagrass sequester more carbon than trees. And if you go along the San Diego coast, we have a couple Torrey pines left over, but we have a lot of lagoons and we have a lot of salt marshes, and we could be saving the planet with that.
Plus, not to mention all of the other, storm surge mitigation benefits and
yes, there are other environmental, there are lots of environmental benefits. I usually just talk about carbon sequestration because it's the thing that gets votes, but you're right. For the science professionals, you have other factors that are really important too.
Yeah. And this is, I love this and learning about this and the work you're doing. And so you chair the Assembly Select Committee on Sea Level Rise and the California economy, which makes you one of the state's leading voices on coastal resilience. And we just heard a lot about that, the early warning system for the bluff collapse. So what drove you to reestablish the committee, and what are significant or interesting findings from your hearings across the state?
So when I got elected in 2018, this was my top priority, because we know in the coastal communities across California, whether it's subsidence in Northern California, erosion, bluff collapses here in San Diego, we know that sea level rise is probably the greatest danger to our coast. And it has an economic impact. So when we get to trying to have bipartisan kind of compromises on how do we protect our coast, I think when you live on the coast, the impact that the coast has to the economy. And I think some of our colleagues inland forget the impact that our coast has on the economy. And so that's why I reestablished it. And there are a couple of findings. So one, I thought we were screwed in San Diego. The Bay Area is way more screwed. That was my first takeaway. 2, You all will all know this, but I think a bunch of legislators forgot our 7th grade science and forgot what equilibrium was. So as sea levels rise, groundwater rises. And so you could do coastal protection, or you can put in a levee, or you could do riprap, or you could do all this stuff. And it doesn't matter because the water is going to come up from the inside. And so that was like my second sea level rise select committee hearing was on groundwater rise. And so then we had a third one. I want to say it was earlier this year or last year. And that was on what are the effects on capped toxic sites? Think about all the low-lying toxic sites that contaminate communities, especially our most vulnerable communities who have typically been poisoned by toxic sites. And then you have groundwater rise from the inside, and none of those sites were capped with the intention. It was to prevent outside water getting in and contaminating the groundwater. It wasn't preventing it from coming up from the inside. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. Not only mapping all the sites, we do not know in California where all the toxic sites are. We don't have a record of that. So to even start and say, where are we? Do we have the correct regulations for that? How are we going to protect these vulnerable communities? Because I think when people think about the California coast, they think about people who look like us. And I think they forget the California coast is about everyone. The coast is for everyone, and it affects our most vulnerable communities. And there's a huge environmental justice and equity component and public health component to it that I think is important to highlight.
Yeah, that's gives me a lot of reflection. And I think it's almost like it needs a rebrand from sea level rise to just water rise, or like it, because it is like one impacts the other. And when you're thinking
we all
about
forgot 7th grade science, equilibrium. Yeah. When they said with this, it was a professor from Berkeley, and she said equilibrium. You should have seen the dais. The entire dais was like, oh, we all know that, and we forgot. Oops.
Yeah.
Back to basics.
Well, and to your point too, it's, the proverbial, an ounce of prevention is worth, 10 of the cure. And when we, are looking at, affordability crisis and, how we can make this state a place where, our residents can continue to live, investing in, preventative measures, looking at what we can do to stop a crisis from happening instead of reacting to it once it happens it's so important.
Yeah, one of the hardest things that I found in the legislature, and if you have any ideas, let me know. One of the hardest things is to get people to see things in a longer timeline. Yeah. So especially on like environmental protection, if you take just the cost of something now, we do 1 to 2 year budget cycles, right? The cost of the 1 to 2 year is high. But if you could actually count the cost, say, of pollution over an entire generational lifespan, and the cost of the public health impacts, the cost of the healthcare system, nobody wants to put a cost on a life, but the cost of health, life, well-being, there's no way anybody wouldn't look at saying this is a small cost for protecting the lives of so many communities. But we don't make those choices. It's like the 2 year budget. Like, are we spending the money on this? Are we spending the money on this year? Versus if we're spending the money on this, now we are saving all this money and all these lives in the future. And that's something so difficult. And I haven't figured out how to crack that, because I talk about it usually when I'm trying to persuade people on my bills, to be honest. I'm like, yeah, well, if you look at the entire cost, of people are like, oh, that's a good point. And I was like, yeah, you can imagine like the cost of mapping all the toxic sites and the cost of holding polluters accountable is actually minimal when you consider one crisis where you have to clean up an entire groundwater system, because you do have groundwater inundation that contaminates the groundwater, right? And pollutes the groundwater. That cleanup and the health impacts are huge. The lawsuit's huge. Everything. No one debates that. It's just these trade-offs now are so hard.
Yeah. Corinne, ideas, opinions? I feel like you probably have a lot of thoughts on that. I know I do, but
With a magic wand, I would love to, see a revision to the way that we do, cost projections in, our legislation and probably in other aspects of, governance as well. I think, I I think being able to look at what the true cost of something is rather than a 2-year cycle is going to help us make better decisions.
And that's where, when you look at the climate crisis and you look at environmental impacts are rarely, it's like what you were saying, Corinne, the ounce of prevention, right? Like you do something now, like if we restore the Buena Vista Lagoon to be like the Santa Leo Lagoon, it would have 1,000-year impact. The cost of that's minimal over 1,000 years, right? Like in terms of how much CO2 are we pulling out and sequestering, all that stuff, and additional environmental benefits of health and safety, water quality, fish, life, wildlife, migratory patterns, you can keep going. But getting people to realize that it's so hard when you're making real everyday trade-offs,
Yeah, I think about this a lot in more on the business side of things. The business world is, for-profit companies are incentivized to generate, or they're actually most have a fiduciary responsibility to do whatever it takes to generate profit the next quarter. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's like hard to do the long-term planning when you are obligated by the Articles of Incorporation to generate profit. And so it's, and then I think just the world we're in today, it's the attention span. I want it now. I want it yesterday. But that's a whole other podcast. Maybe a tea time.
Well, I did marketing communications for 15 years. I actually had a career before I was elected. And Twitter and reducing everything down to 140 characters. I know it's not limited to 140 characters anymore, but that concept actually undermined our ability for people to understand complex intersectional issues, So don't get me started on that. That's an
That's what I was gonna say.
I was like, I'll go down the rabbit hole with you.
I love it. I would gladly join you. But I'll get back to the topic at hand. So, your AB 823 to ban plastic microbeads in leave-on personal care and cleaning products passed unanimously. You have said plastic pollution impacts more than our marine life. It's public health care. Can you elaborate on the importance of expanding California's 2015 ban?
So 2015 was just on rinse off personal care products, and 823, my bill this last year, was about leave-on cosmetics and plastic glitter and abrasive cleaning and microplastics and abrasive cleaning products. And it's super important because we've known for decades as women, that it affects our breasts, our ovaries, our uterus, our organs. And I had actually thought, now that men figured out that it affected their bodies too, that we would get it through. And unfortunately, the governor did veto it. And so I don't think it makes the science behind it less valid or the need for it less valid. So we will be bringing it back when the time is right.
And I think along that topic, so how do you work to communicate the importance of something that might seem like, quote, smaller for the environmental issues?
That's an interesting question. So in my first select committee on sea level rise, I had a professor from UCSD. And I said, you're sitting here with a bipartisan group, bicameral group. We had assembly members and senators. What should we focus on? And he said, it didn't matter, big or small. Anything that reduces greenhouse gas emissions now has an exponential impact on the climate crisis, right? Because it's science, and I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys understand science. So my view is repeating that, and whatever it is, big or small, let's do whatever we can. Catherine Blakespeare has been a big advocate for composting. And when she first started talking about it, Germany's had composting for decades. Like they just have the bio, they call it bio trash, biomood. And so I was like, composting, sure, like fine, that's fine. And then I got into the assembly, and one of my roles a couple years ago was assistant majority leader for policy and research, which is the queen of the nerds, as I used to call it, right? And I love being the queen of the nerds. I had 5 great nerds working for me. And I said, let's do a short paper, and it's for the Democratic caucus, so they're not publicly available, on composting and see like on our methane reduction goals. One, we're nowhere near meeting our methane reduction goals. 2, composting is the number one thing individuals can do every day to save the planet. And I was like, oh, Catherine was right. Let's compost. And then you have LA County who's fighting it, which is really, really hard because it is complex. Like when you get away from a single family household and you have multifamily, you have multiple units, you have mixed commercial and residential, you have venues, like it becomes hard, right? But it is the number one way we can reduce methane emissions individually as a person in California today. So go compost.
Yes, we had we had an episode with one of our compost queens down here in San Diego a few months ago, Lisa Wood, who's taught me everything I know about composting, and that's a lot.
I know a lot about composting, but I have to say, since I saw that report, every time I eat a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables for lunch, and I love peppers, green pepper, or not green peppers. I don't like green peppers. I like red, yellow, orange. So I eat like a pepper a day. And so every time I take that center part with the seeds and I put in the compost, I was like, I'm saving the planet. And it feels so good.
Yeah, I have my green bin, and same. I'm like so proud of myself when I compost.
We should be.
It's so like, should be.
It's the number one thing we can do to save the planet as an individual on a daily basis, right? Like, when we look at methane reductions, there's not a lot. When you look at dairy industry, if you look at cattle, look at all these other things, they're kind of bigger, harder solutions. Individual composting is actually what you could do on a daily basis and feel good about yourself.
I'm going to make my husband listen to this episode because I have tried very hard to implement we have this city-led composter that, seeds, we can do, bones. We have our backyard composter, which is a little more restrictive, but again, it keeps it solely within our backyard. We can reuse it in our own soil. And then we have our freezer bag that we use to make stock. And so depending on what part of the vegetable it is, or fruit, or, whatever, it goes in one of those 3 things. And he thinks it's not worth the effort, and I overthink it, and it causes a lot of friction. But now I have the stat I can throw at him where it is the single easiest, greatest thing that I can do to reduce methane emissions. And therefore, we are going all in on my 3-step composting process.
You should. And when the zombie apocalypse happens, we're all coming to your house.
Yep.
There we go. I love it. So moving on, I have a question. Some questions about CEQA, which as environmental professionals, CEQA drives a lot of the work we do here in California. And so you, the sole vote against SB 71, which streamlines CEQA review for transit, bicycle, and pedestrian projects. Can you walk us through your thinking on that vote and kind of, in the same context, how you balance environmental protection with climate action goals?
Well, if I recall in SB 71, I would probably, the CEQA is really complicated. You all know that. The way I look at it is, I don't believe streamlining CEQA is anything different than getting rid of CEQA. And I think the environmental review process is really important. I have very limited exemptions. Like I remember there was an Umberg bill that allowed us to change a use of a hotel or motel to a permanent supportive housing facility. And that's because it's a change of use examination and not a disturbing of the soil examination, right? And in North County, you'll know that we have a lot of cut flowers and nurseries that are zoned for housing, but haven't been remediated because they're currently in use as nurseries. And a lot of those soils often have have pesticides in the soil. And so I think it's important to have the environmental review to see what you're dealing with. And so there might be things about who can sue for CEQA. There might be some administrative streamlining we could do. But I think removing the environmental analysis isn't the approach we should take in the state, right? We should, if we think something doesn't need CEQA because you're taking a current 4-lane road and you're adding bike lanes, that's fine. But AB 71 was far broader than that. And so I'm very, very hesitant to remove environmental analysis because the reason it's there is to prevent contaminations of communities in the future. And if we're not looking at what has been there, then I don't know how we're going to say in the future that we're not contaminating people. And I think the whole thing is like, the whole first rule of government is like, let's not kill people, right? I think that's a good first rule of government. Like, first, let's keep people alive and keep people healthy. And when we remove environmental analysis, I worry that we're not having the tools to be able to fine tune it. So if it's very narrow, I will look at it. If it's a narrow exemption, I'll look at the circumstance, like change of use, I'm more flexible on than getting rid of it when we're doing an environmental analysis. Because if you did that, you're not taking into account vehicle miles traveled. You're not taking into account greenhouse emissions that are being released or increased or decreased, right? You just don't have the data. So that's my position. And, you're both from my district, so you'll know CEQA is a household name, not just in your homes, but in most homes, because people want to know we're paying a lot of money to live in a place and we want our children to be healthy. And I think that's a pretty normal thing for a parent to want, is to have healthy children.
Yes, very, very reasonable.
I think it's reasonable. Clearly, I was the dissenting vote. So
no, I think it's helpful too. Or sorry, go ahead, Corinne.
No, I just maybe on the flip side of that, and we've seen, the abundance agenda kind of pick up steam, and you have people who never knew what CEQA was, maybe still don't know what CEQA is, pointing fingers at CEQA about you are the reason why, high-speed rail or why renewable energy isn't happening as quickly as it should in California. Any thoughts there, or how that's, maybe a bit of a fallacy argument, or
I think it's a red herring. I don't think CEQA is red tape. Are there lawyers out there that misuse CEQA to stop a project? Yes. But then let's stop the lawyers from misusing CEQA, not get rid of CEQA, right? CEQA is not the problem. The problem is when a project is a mitigated neg deck and then it's treated as a full environmental CEQA project, right? Like, the problem is, what gradation are we getting to? So the problem, I think, in the kind of abundance agenda or any of these other agendas is they've conflated CEQA with red tape. And it's not CEQA that's the problem, it's the misuse of CEQA that is the problem. And I will tell you, there are no bills to get at that because it's complicated. Like, there are no bills to get, say, like, let's not be able to, if this is what it is, you cannot require a higher standard, right? And there's nothing about and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to this. But how do you get at the misuse of CEQA? Because I don't think getting rid of CEQA is the answer. I think getting rid of the misuse of CEQA, but I think a very smart lawyer can probably figure that one out. A very smart environmental lawyer can probably figure that out. So if there's a very smart environmental lawyer listening to this, tell me how we get rid of the misuse of CEQA, not CEQA itself. Because it's not the environmental analysis that's ever the problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, both, me personally, professionally, and then, speaking on, behalf of legislative efforts that AEP is engaged in too, is, that threshold for the MND that you brought up, that fair argument standard that lets everything kind of automatically get elevated into an environmental impact report. That is something that, collectively, we as a community are so passionate about trying to fix. We had maybe a little glimmer of it last legislative session. Let's see what happens, in the next one. And you are preaching to the choir on that.
Yeah, so that is usually what my votes are about, is like, and because it's a red herring, that unintended consequence, you could both see that, right? The unintended consequence is we're just gonna streamline, which is get rid of the environmental review. And then after the fact, someone's gonna sue because they're gonna say you should have known. And the state's on the hook for that. And that's, again, going back to our first timeline question, this is a timeline problem.
Yeah, one of my questions actually was, what reforms, if any, do you think are needed? And what I'm hearing is, how do we
need a smart environmental lawyer who wants to protect the planet, keep CEQA, and prevent the misuse of CEQA? Because I would see it when I was on city council and the planning commission. I'd see lawyers sue a project, and I, like, having read the entire EIR, I knew they were fine because I voted for it, right? I knew they were on the right side. But there were lawyers that were telling community members, no, we could get this, we could get this. And they were always basically, taking people's money, giving them false hope, and then dying in court. But that took 2 years. That adds cost to a project. And that's the type of stuff that I think we should figure out how we get at. It's not CEQA itself.
All right, our call to action.
Say CEQA is the problem than to deal with the harder problem is how do you go into how are you surgical in the judiciary system?
Okay. Email the assembly member, please, with your ideas, with your
my staff is probably going to be like, oh my God, she could put her
great
for the entire world.
I suspect you might be hearing from AEP's legislative committee as well with some thoughts on that.
Yes, let's do it. Like, I think, we have to protect the environment. Like, there's no one who wants to buy a house and find out 10 years later, 20 years later, when our daughter gets cancer, that soil was contaminated that she played in. None of us moms want that guilt. So I don't know why we would do it to anybody else. Right?
Kind of dovetailing off this a little bit is that you have a lot of stakeholders to manage and deal with. I mean, you mentioned already, like, attorneys, you have the cities. Obviously there's the county of San Diego, there's the military bases within your district, and then other legislators, the state. Like, what's your approach to navigating these stakeholder relationships and keeping your priorities at the forefront?
Well, no one believes this when I tell them this, but if you spend any time with me, you'll know I can't be bothered to lie. And I can't be bothered to lie, not because I have more integrity than anybody else. It's just because I'm a mom and I can't remember what I told this person and what I told that person. I'll mess up and get caught. So I don't want to get caught. So I tell people what it is, even if it's not happy news. And so when you get a reputation of just, what you see is what you get, it makes it easier to give people bad news. It makes it more fun to give them good news when that happens. I also have certain structures. I came from the private sector and I've started 2 businesses in my life. So I like structure. And so I have 8 advisory councils, district advisory councils, where I bring local stakeholders in. We just finished up a whole round last week of the 8. So it's everything from jobs in the economy to water, environment, and sustainability, to public safety, emergency response, and wildfires. Like, we just have 8 of them. Transportation and mobility, we have, 8. And with those 8, I bring in local stakeholders. So if sometimes they're just constituents who are an expert in issue, sometimes they're government affairs for people locally, sometimes they're city employees, so like a city manager or a planning director. Sometimes they're going to be a school board member or a council member or a supervisor who's interested in the area. And so I just bring everybody together, even if they're opposing sides. So, so that, because at the end of the day, I hear everything from everyone, And it's easier for me to hear what people will say in front of maybe opposing sides. Also, it's a good reason to eat popcorn. You hear them and you're like, oh, let them fight. Let's see what they're going to say. But what happens is when you bring everybody together and you make them sit at one table, you could actually cut through what the issues are a little bit more surgically than if you met with them individually. So I do that to keep, and then I do community coffees to bring people together to hear from constituents what they're interested in. I have like 3 to 5 events every weekend in San Diego. So I'm out in the community. I hear from people. And then, we work 12-hour days when we're up in Sacramento. And so I take a lot of meetings, and I have great staff.
This is one of them. So thank you.
Yeah, well, you're not a meeting, you're fun, you're a podcast. We get to talk to people about things we all care about.
And when you have these stakeholder meetings and kind of like you're talking about like getting opposing sides, do you see that there's like a core issue that rises where it's like, okay, everybody, this seems to be something that like people are aligned on?
I'd say every year it's different. So I'd say we ended in 21 or 22. We ended surprise ambulance billing. And that actually came from my Oceanside fire chief, because in Oceanside, ambulance service was provided by the fire department. And you had all these surprise bills. And when people get a surprise ambulance bill, they will often default on it. So you had this underfunding of the fire department because of the surprise billing laws. And it took us 3 years to get it through, but we got it through. And then on housing, which is kind of difficult on the coast, you can imagine. I actually worked with a friend of mine who's an architect. And in 2018, when I won, on the back of a napkin, I wrote like what became AB 803 of 2021, which is my Starter Home Revitalization Act, right? I wrote it on the back of a napkin. It took 3 years to get that one through. Blue carbon was one that came out of one of my district advisory councils. Basically, how do we take the San Leo Lagoon and make that the standard practice in the state, not just a best practice? So a lot of them come out of the district advisory councils, but every year there's, and in every issue area, like in our health advisory council, the big issue is what are we doing about the lack of federal funding and how are we going to keep people healthy? Right. And there are different ways to do that. And different people have different ideas on how to do that. You have district hospitals, you have nonprofit hospitals, you have, federally qualified health clinics. They all pull from different pots. And so they all want different things. So I assume anything that is facing cuts in federal funding is going to be a big priority for this coming year, because we just don't, we're a donor state in the United States in terms of we give way more federal money or way more tax money to the feds than we get back as a state. And so when we don't get that money back on top of giving out so much, then the real question is like, how do we do things that we all care about? Like, I don't know one person who doesn't think children should be healthy. I don't know one person who thinks if kids are hungry, they're going to learn. Right? Like, I don't think I think there are a bunch of non-controversial issues in California that we're really facing really tough funding questions on.
Well, thank you for doing the work out there on behalf of your constituents and humanity. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and I think, that's an incredible track record for 7 years in the assembly so far. And just, we don't always have reasons to feel hope and optimistic. So rounding that out and, to your goal of, saving the world for your daughter, if you had to pick one thing quickly that you are most proud of that should give us all hope and optimism, what would it be?
Oh, gosh, one thing that would give me hope. What gives me hope? I don't know. I would have to say, you see all these scandals in the news about politicians. 99% of politicians are not corrupt. 99% of politicians are people who are well-intended and want to do a good job. And so it gives me hope, especially we have this big freshman class who came in and got traumatized by the LA fires. I don't even know what that was. Like my first day, I had a for-profit university close. I had all these students who immediately their student loan debt became due. They didn't have access to their transfers. They couldn't transfer. They couldn't deal with this stuff. And that traumatized me. I didn't even have keys to my district office. And this new class of legislators came in, 23 of them, and a lot of them were from LA and had to deal with the fires. And that was hard. And they have hope. They do extra credit. They do Zoom calls at 10 p.m. After I've worked 15 hours, I'm probably not doing a Zoom call at 10 p.m. I can guarantee you that. I'm probably asleep. And so I think working with the people in the legislature, even if we have different positions and even if we have different value systems, I think most people want to do good. And I don't know how to share that with regular everyday people because all they see is the scandals in the news. They don't see news articles like Tasha's trying to do a good job. Tasha votes her district. Like they don't see news like that. They don't know Catherine's fighting really hard on the environment. Catherine Blakespeare is fighting really hard on the environment and composting as she's EQ chair, environmental quality chair in the Senate, right? So they don't see stories about that. They see the negative stories. And that makes people like, every time people meet me, they're like, oh, I didn't think politicians were like you. I was like, a lot of us are like me. We have a bunch of moms in the assembly. Since I came in 2018, we've gotten more moms in the assembly. And, I personally think if there's one thing that I think we should do is we should get more moms elected to positions of elected power.
Oh, I love that. And on that note, I think that's so hopeful. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear these helicopters in my background. Okay, great. It's just me. On that note, let's get into the rapid five. So what's your favorite daily habit?
I actually have a gratitude practice because sometimes my job is very hard and it's easy to forget that I'm grateful for so many things. So when I get up in the morning, when I put my feet on the ground, I say, today is a great day. And at night when I lay down in bed, I try to find the smallest things I'm grateful for. And when my daughter is just like me packed into a smaller human. And when she and I are like in off moods, I was like, okay, we're stopping. We're doing gratitude practice. And we go rapid fire back and forth. What are things that we're grateful for? My camera moved, sorry. What are things that we're grateful for that happened that day? And it does change your mind. So that's my daily habit that I think has actually rewired my brain.
I love that for all of us. I think is we can take that the habit. What are 3 things you'd bring to a deserted island?
So avocados, because avocados have all the essential minerals that you would need to sustain healthy brain health. I would bring solar panels so I can still have electronics. And because I'm always cold, I bring my beanie.
Yay! It looks great. That's a really cute beanie.
Amazon.
I love it.
I lose them everywhere. They're probably all over 80s, 77. It's like my 10th one.
Your calling card. What's your favorite environmental policy?
Oh, I love blue carbon, blue tech stuff, blue economy. Love all that stuff. It's my favorite thing to work on.
And your favorite flora or fauna?
I love chrysanthemums.
Oh, that's lovely.
And finish this sentence. Wouldn't it be cool if?
It's going to sound dumb and maybe momish, but if we treated everybody like we wanted to be treated, the world would be a better place.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be updated when new episodes are released and leave us a review to let us know what you think. It also really helps us to share the podcast with others who may enjoy learning about the environmental industry. If you want to submit a shout out or any feedback, please send an email or voice memo to podcast@califaep.org. The email again is podcast with an S, podcast@califaep.org.